In the summer of 1923, the 5,000-ton U.S. Army transport, or USAT ship Buford, sat alone and forgotten in the San Francisco shipyard. Within 34 years of rich and otherwise controversial military service behind her, she was finally ready to face the breaker's scrapping torch. The Buford was renamed after a U.S. Army cavalry officer who fought for the United States Union as a brigadier general during the American Civil War in the 1860s. Originally from the divided state of Kentucky, he is credited for fighting against the Confederates and for strategic and heroic victories in the Second Bull Run of 1862, as well as the Gettysburg Campaign of 1863. The really very fine, streamlined early White Star Line-esque ship debuted in 1890, just 5 years before a buster of a little vaudevillian scamp Joseph Frank Keaton was born, originally as the British transatlantic ocean liner, the SS Mississippi. She was constructed at the Harland Wolff Shipyard in Belfast, Ireland as a combined passenger and cargo ship. It's reported that between 1891 and 1897 to have made 44 transatlantic crossings from London to New York. But this really very small and quaint yet opulent liner that cried of an imperial age, and with but one propeller, the smallest of her 4 sister ships, was quickly snatched from the Atlantic Transport Line by the U.S. Army in 1898, less than 10 years after her maiden voyage. She was refitted for this permanent role at Newport News, Virginia, not in time for the Spanish-American War efforts for Cuba's independence from Spain, but made useful enough for cargo runs from San Francisco to Manila. That same year, 3-year-old Joseph Frank Keaton lost part of a finger in a clothes wringer requiring stitches. Just 3 years earlier, he was carried off from a second-story window by a cyclone in Kansas. All before he turned 10, Keaton experienced a number of physical traumas, including a head gash that also required stitches when he missed the mark and the rock he threw up in the air hit him square in the forehead, and near suffocation after a steamer trunk fell on him while sleeping soundly in an overnight train car. But it was at only 6 months old when he was supposedly given the nickname Buster by none other than Harry Houdini himself, who was in the same theater troupe as he and his parents after the young infant fell down a steep set of stairs completely unharmed. "That's some Buster your baby took," were, according to Keaton himself, the words Houdini used to launch the rising star's legendary title. Meanwhile, on May 27, 1897, the Mississippi found herself in a confrontation when she collided with the Thingvalla line ship Helka off the Newfoundland banks in the midst of very thick fog in the dead of night. In September of the same year, the Mississippi was grounded off the coast of London after avoiding collision with a small coal schooner. Perhaps such resilience made this ship the perfect candidate for a life of a recruited military vessel. In the same vein, perhaps the resilience brought on by these events and this ever-moving vaudevillian lifestyle molded Keaton into the daring, versatile, and cutting-edge silent film actor he eventually became. As James A.G. described him in an article in the September 5, 1949 issue of Life magazine titled Comedy's Greatest Era, the only major comedian who ever kept sentiment almost entirely out of his work, and he brought pure physical comedy to its greatest heights. Beneath his lack of emotion, he was also uninsistently sardonic. Deep below that, giving a disturbing tension and grandeur to the foolishness in his comedy, there was a freezing whisper, not of pathos, but of melancholia. With the humor, the craftsmanship, and the action, there was often, besides, a fine, still, and sometimes dreamlike beauty. Also, relatability. In just about every picture, he is the average Joe trying to accomplish one of life's quintessential pursuits. School, career, romance, the everyday. All the while addressing big, exciting, and existential situations and subject matters the human race finds itself privy to in the grand spectrum of life. Even after a century of change in world history and the esoteric setting of the 1920s these films are thus captured in, it's like I'm in his exact same situation, racing to the finish line with him each and every time. And this is exactly how the Navigator begins. In a certain sense, that is. Keaton plays a callously wealthy young heir who must get married by 27 years of age, or else his fortune gets cut. Originally released on October 13, 1924, I wanted to cover this picture almost exactly a century after it debuted. It remains one of Keaton's most celebrated pictures, even one of his own personal favorites. Released to an audience who were just as much impressed as they were mesmerized. Looking back 100 years really brings perspective into the things that have changed very drastically, as well as the things that have remained universally unchanged. And this film depicts the best of both worlds. Because this channel is all about the great dames of the high seas, and this series about the great ships of cinema throughout time, it was the perfect candidate for this series, and one that does not disappoint. For we get a rare glimpse at a special, almost pioneering class of ocean liner in beautiful, immersive detail. The Buford was rescued by Keaton's stalwart technician director, who spotted the Buford wasting away while he was busy on set producing the biggest grossing epic of the year by First National Pictures titled The Seahawk. Keaton's team was running out of ideas for the next big picture, one that could really put Keaton back on the map. At a leasing price of $25,000, or about $4.6 million in today's money, from the Atlantic Siberia Navigation Company, the Buford was that ticket in. And the producer who funded the sizable contribution, Joseph M. Schenck, didn't even have a clear picture as to how. By 1924, the wounds and scars of the Great War still loomed deep within the hearts of many Americans. And this restless disgruntlement that questioned the current systems of government and society expressed itself in many mediums. The opening of The Navigator uses these two quiet characters who are suddenly caught up in a funny little war between two small countries far across the sea, perhaps as a metaphor of sorts, as the events in this film change them and their current status of their really quite comfortable, though arguably restless lives forever. Talk about a character arc. And there is our first glimpse of arguably the real main character, the USAT Buford. Whatever location this is supposed to be in the film, in reality, this scene was shot on location at the Redondo Beach Pier in Los Angeles, California. The opulent government building, or else hotel depicted, is actually a very small set constructed at a bluff overlooking Wharf 1, one of many built in 1888 to accommodate the thriving lumber industry of the Pacific Northwest. Wharf 1 is still with us today, actually. Before rear projection, this authentic method of storytelling illusion gave us the true depth of authenticity that Keaton helped pioneer in the ever-expanding age of movie making. The Navigator was shot in 4 total locations, including Redondo Beach, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Avalon and Catalina Island. In the movie, the ship called Navigator cleverly has connections to the wealthy ship owner, John O'Brien, played by Frederick Vroom, father of the main leading female character, Betsy, played by Catherine McGuire. Our second bout of humorously presented commentary gives us Keaton's character, Rollo Treadway. He, somewhat unlike his counterpart Betsy, is a stiff, technically driven, and no-nonsense heir who appears not only to take his wealth for granted, but equally with a certain muted callous. Rollo, much more than Betsy, who at least has a good head on her shoulders, has a lot of character growth to accomplish. This hilarious gag was filmed in San Francisco's Pacific Heights neighborhood, which has gone mostly unchanged in over 100 years, beside the tearing down of several homes pictured. Right across the way, we get what could be young Mr. Treadway's first ever rejection in his very privileged and apparently very aloof life when young Miss O'Brien rejects his proposal. It's also the first evidence of humanity in this young man who, perhaps is not heartless, just tightly contained by the blinding ease of his wealthy life. For he really does look to care about the woman, preparing a luxurious cruise for their honeymoon and keeping a photo of her close by in lieu of his affection. Something not seen as all too wholesome today, but hopefully was the case 100 years ago. But a man like Treadway does not change his plans for no one, and what would have been a romantic honeymoon is to become a decompressing rehab cruise. Here's where my suspension of disbelief becomes a little stilted. By coincidence, Miss O'Brien comes with her father on the request to get some papers from his ship, while Treadway has no check-ins or evidence of any crew or fellow passenger around him. Then again, this man is quite aloof, unable to see beyond the bridge of his nose, so to speak. So perhaps his unaware life of exclusivity further blinds his understanding about society and how it works. For all he knows, the ship was reserved especially for him. Here we receive some of the first brilliant gags of the film, quickly followed by Miss O'Brien's reconnaissance with Treadway, and a breathtaking image of this very stately ship moving in real time like the Line Victory still does today, with the wind and the moving water, no doubt to rescue her father who has been captured. It's hard to believe this beautiful ship was the subject of so much war and the dread of political espionage, though the ship did appear to be remodeled for filming. Interior captures of the ship prior to filming is hard to come by, so who's to say what the ship looked like in her long military career? For the Buford starred in a great number of picture-worthy events, and one such event might give us insight into her inner appearance during the military portion of her service career. In December 1919, close to a year after the end of World War I, the Buford sailed out of New York to Hanko, Finland, with 249 undesirables, deported for their association with the anarchist organization, Union of Russia Workers, in response to the first iteration of the Red Scare and subsequent fear of radical communist influence and violent riot-raising leaders in the US. This 28-day voyage coined her the nickname Soviet Ark, containing a handful of well-known radical Russian anarchist leaders. The Buford was described later by Emma Goldman in her book My Delusionment in Russia as a leaky old tub repeatedly endangering our lives during the month's odyssey. Interesting that Joseph M. Schenck, a Russian-born American film studio executive who also co-founded and became the chairman of 20th Century Fox, 5 Keaton pictures including The Navigator, was the one to produce this movie and fund this incredibly expensive ship. I wonder if he knew anything about the debatable notoriety of this ship. This and other events in the ship's history really gave me a different perspective when watching this movie in preparation for this video. The ghost ship angle this film accentuates and highlights here and in an upcoming scene also became just a little more real to me, and the plotline that much more compelling. In more heroic news, in September 1894, the ex-Mississippi was called to rescue all 9 crew members from a sunken Norwegian ship. Keaton and the Buford were a match made, the perfect complement to one another, both having dealt with a lot of turmoil in their very illustrious, though very bumpy lives. What could have been the peak and therefore the waning denouement of both their careers was not only a fresh renewal, but an outright flight in legendary status. Because while the Buford's fate was being apparently solidified in the San Francisco shipyard in 1923, that same year, Buster Keaton starred in 3 shorts before debuting in his first full-length feature called 3 Ages. His third full-length picture, Sherlock Jr., though, received mixed reviews from critics, and even himself described it as alright, but not one of the big ones. He was undoubtedly an established star by the time, but not as big as his contemporaries like Charlie Chaplin and Harold Lloyd. And his professional relationship with Fatty Arbuckle, who helped launch him into stardom in 1917, was not a good look after the sexual abuse and murder trials 2 years before. Arbuckle was blackballed from the industry, forcing him into directing roles for his own pictures. Keaton starred in a total of 39 pictures before The Navigator. 36 of these were short films, plenty of time to perfect the craft that, in my opinion, is as original and inspirational as it was over 100 years ago. And while his career was taking something of a downturn, The Navigator became his highest grossing picture and indeed put him back on the map. In other words, Schenck and his fellow producers made back the 2024 inflated equivalent $4.6 million they spent on the Buford handsomely. The movie made $680,406 or 12.6 million in 100 years later inflation money, and the Buford herself would last a further 5 years before finally facing the breaker's torch. Speaking of maps, I can feel the terrifying subjection Miss O'Brien is enduring when the ropes are sabotaged by these political insurgencies who plan on sinking the ship that would carry the opponent's supplies. Little did they realize, nor perhaps care, that they would be trapping the fates of 2 innocent people into drifting uncertainty. The gangway becomes unstable, land becomes so close and yet so far away, and the SS Navigator finds herself drifting helplessly at sea. In reality, this opening scene is most likely one of the many shots right outside the Avalon coast, showing true dedication to their craft. Keaton, McGuire, and crew lived on the ship for 10 weeks to complete all the scenes filmed on board. And for the first time, we get a true glimpse of this magnificent ship highlighted in all the 100-year-ago daylight splendor of the California coast. Perhaps these first-class accommodations were recreated from the ship's original first 10-year plan as the Mississippi. The movie truly gave new life to not only Keaton's career, but the Buford's as well. With all this restoration work, it's no wonder she lasted another 5 years before hitting the breakers in 1929 to be specific, extending the ship's life for iconic adventures in Alaska. Iconic because the reputation the film gave her provided many excited tourists a very immersive experience, much like the Pacific and Island Princess did when represented in the Love Boat series in the late 1970s. It really is hard to believe from these images that traces of her military life or notorious Soviet Ark voyage ever transpired. And it truly makes for an ocean liner enthusiast's vicarious dream come true to witness as the backdrop for the gag of these 2 displaced victims missing one another's presence by just a hair. What a vivaciously wide promenade that ships today are so sorely lacking. How delightful to get such a grand tour of this quaint vessel that has White Star Line influence written all over her oceanic-inspired visage. The air vent that used to be the natural way method of air circulation aboard ship is used to bring young Rollo to the next scene, showcasing his supposed affection for the woman of his supposed dreams. One thing I love about the Navigator is that, like is the trope of a lot of Keaton's work, it takes what could easily be a romantic setting with a lot of slapstick hijinks and quite literally voids it of any life at all. Treadway and O'Brien are completely alone aboard this vessel with antiquated decor and ghostly mystère around every corner. They're forced to face themselves as they're stranded, albeit luxuriously, aboard this abandoned liner that in some way reflects the void in the otherwise bourgeois status of their own lives. Though O'Brien appears to have much more sound and reason than our poor filthy rich schmuck Treadway. Except that they don't even enjoy the luxurious accommodations, spending most of the time in the galley. The ship's kitchen looks to be one of the many sound stages in Los Angeles many of the indoor scenes were filmed in. And it too gives us great insight into the cookware and products of the time. A perfect time capsule. We also get a glimpse of the oddly resourceful incompetence of our man Rollo. We laugh at the privileged ignorance that brought him to this point, but root the otherwise good-natured man on at the same time. They really don't make ship helms like they used to, though we do gain insight into different flag meanings. In this case, we can't see here, the quarantine flag is yellow, on the chance that you pass by a vessel flagging such a color. At 8 knots, the Navigator should be able to catch up with the USS McDermott, or DD-262, a Clemson-class destroyer for the U.S. Navy, serviced from 1918 to 1932. Though at a speed of 35 knots, perhaps it's just as well Rollo was attempting to row the Navigator toward this far more modern military vessel. Just gaze upon those OG Titanic-related lifeboat davits before the advent of the more efficient, over-the-deck Taylor gravity davits shipped like the preserved Queen Mary are famous for. And I do appreciate the continuity of keeping the gangway in the same place they left it. But it is too bad a lady like Betsy has to endure such a traumatizing stupor for our benefit. Utilizing Keaton's own stunts, however, it does provide Rollo some character development, earning rather than purchasing this fair lady's love and affection upon a deck chair I long for in my own collection. Alone on a drifting abandoned ship at night isn't my idea of a good time either, and this scene, reflecting perhaps the horrors of the ship's strenuous military past, is certainly not going unnoticed by me. How oddly relevant. I am confident, however, that most of this scene is one filmed on a soundstage in Los Angeles. I do envy their US Navy outfits, however, as I long myself for one in my own collection. Though the Austrian one I own from the 1960s does suit me just fine when the occasion calls for it, that is. The use of pyrotechnics here is one of the many facets that made Keaton such a trailblazer in the history of celluloid. Another of my favorite moments comes when all the doors on the deck open at once. If this is not a stage, I marvel at how this very practical effect is accomplished aboard the Buford in no doubt the late hours off the Catalina coast. Another reflection of the ghostly remnants of the ship's military career. This painting too would scare me as much. What an absolute genius gag utilizing this crewman's immortalized on canvas and on celluloid face. So very much attention to detail is to be marveled at. I also appreciate this, what has to be advertisement for Victor Records that carries the movie's theme home and utilizes cool special effects of the time. Though I dare ask, why keep shuffling a dead deck, my friend? Weeks later, in what I am only sure are Hollywood sets, though very impressive ones, we get a glimpse into shipboard life at the time, including literally within the engines. The Buford was installed with triple expansion steam engines. Invented in the US in 1880, this system has been used to propel many famous ships throughout the sea. Steam entered 3 double-acting cylinders, exhausting them into a separate condenser that helped activate the condenser, which created a vacuum effect to move the propellers and push the ship forward. Titanic had 3 sets of these, allowing her to go at lengths of 24 knots. Though brilliant, they are not my idea of a safe respite, Rollo. Who would want to sleep in one of these? We receive a beautiful lesson too in survival and resilience. They are truly carrying on, and in resourceful and innovative ways. But here we reach the dramatically climactic event of this momentous picture. Not only is the land they spot full of a cannibal tribe, the size and shape of their ship making them prime targets, but their only way out also strikes a literal leak, and Rollo is forced to make a brave and daring move to save the ship as well as themselves from a gruesomely imminent end. Keaton could have hired a stuntman just as much as he could have performed this role in a sort of glass-enclosed dunk tank aquarium on the lot like what was common at the time. Instead, he spent a month in the fresh, frigid waters of Lake Tahoe with a custom-built diving suit that expanded the faceplate of the diving helmet so the audience would know that it was authentically him in the role. All to accomplish this scene that made the film one of the choice favorites by audiences as well as Keaton himself. Which is to mean that this is not a set at all like I originally thought, but in fact the seabed of Lake Tahoe as it was in 1924. But as if all this brilliance wasn't enough, they decided to throw in a swordfish gag. I wonder if they ate the swordfish later. The likes of surrealist artists Salvador Dali and Louise Buñuel were said to be mesmerized by this segment of the picture and probably inspired future artwork. The cannibal segment can be seen as problematic, a didn't age well product of its time. Not that cannibals did not exist, and the scenario isn't valid in its own right, but that African-American actors like Noble Johnson, who played the chief cannibal in this picture, was often typecast, as he also was in the 1933 version of King Kong, where he played the exotic villain. It was one of many typecast scenarios that didn't help to evade systematic racism sentiment that still prevails in society today. If only the scene was created with the express face value context that it depicts. It really is tragic the discriminatory undertones it communicates. I suppose it can be said, as it were, that it is an impressive scene nonetheless. I do love how Keaton, with his suit on, is used as a floating life raft of sorts, for example, and their return to the fallen gangway, still holding on for dear life, like our surviving shipmates who have developed well beyond the placid socialites they started out as in this picture. How very poetic. Though I do sincerely doubt that Miss O'Brien's hair would remain that flawless after several weeks at sea.
That's Hollywood for you.
And what a beautiful shot we get of the ship's forward starboard well deck section. We get a real sense of the ship's size and splendor here, a kind of design and craftsmanship we just don't get anymore. More still, we get delightful shots of the Buford's Titanic-like decks, with that counter-elliptical stern reminiscent of many wooden sailing ships you also just don't get on modern ships. Another wonderfully thrilling gag as our man Rollo attempts to axe away the cannibals' final means of entering the ship, the rising tension as they are outsmarted, the incredible stunt work clear on the prow that I would love to reenact on board the Queen Mary in Long Beach, the assurance given to the audience letting us know that our main characters we have grown to love will live a happy and no doubt married life, change for the better, and inspiring the problem-solving efforts we, the audience, are forced to face in our own everyday lives. Surely, in the darkest of hours, we too can be rescued by a random submarine with a hunky mustache crewman to soften our fall, who kinda resembles Charlie Chaplin. Am I the only one seeing this? Was that a burn to one of Keaton's fiercest rivals? Does anyone have any insight on this? And all lived happily ever after. It's an absolutely brilliant film I can watch over and over that I would highly recommend watching over and over. There's something so therapeutic about silent pictures. The music, the bit of light reading, really helps the mind think in the otherwise fast-paced, dialogue-heavy world we live in today. Now, depending on the version of this now public domain picture you watch, the impression you achieve may depend on the soundtrack or the score. My first watch was a rendition that had a strange, eerie score that, while in places made perfect sense, kind of killed the gags, the action, and the romance in all other places. Though it was the only version I watched that had the full intact canon gag you see here at the 1.1 hour mark. I have linked that very version as well as a few others I enjoyed in the description below. In the silent film era, live performers provided the soundtrack. The earliest revision score on record was written by a Mr. Claude Bolling, with an ensemble of 20 musicians in the 1960s when much of Keaton's work was rediscovered and subsequently re-released. And all before Keaton died in February of 1966 at 70 years old. There is also a 1995 Robert Israel version among the many that have been released since the film entered public domain. Compared to Sherlock Jr., which today is heralded as a daring and clever masterpiece of silent cinema, The Navigator even at the time received just as rave reviews from scholars and critics alike for the story, acting, timing, and special effects. The Buford was owned by F. Linderman of San Francisco from 1926 to 1927. Continuing her renewed life with the Alaskan-Siberia Navigation Company, full of happy tourists around very specific coast routes, until February 1929, where she sailed from Los Angeles to Yokohama, Japan, under the command of Captain A. J. Lauer. A ship, Buford, and a man, Keaton, both with brilliant legacies that are preserved today through a film that put them both back on the map and into the hearts of generations of audience members. And to think, all this took place just 100 years ago. Subscribe, hit the bell notification, leave a comment in the comment section for more. Thank you.